I've done over 1,000 real money fantasy football drafts already in 2025 with a few $1,000s at stake this fantasy football season. Here's what you need to know if you plan on dominating your fantasy football drafts in 2025. There is arguably no better feeling in fantasy football than when you land an absolute steal. You get my 2025 Fantasy Football Draft Dominator, which is jam-packed with strategy and analysis for 250-plus players. And he's been strong in fantasy football. He's averaging over 18 fantasy points per game over 25 career games where he's played at least 73% of the offensive snaps. 2025 Week Winner, formerly known as the Heat Map. So you can conquer start-sit dilemmas, find plug-and-play streamers, and dominate your weekly matchups with this one-of-a-kind resource, Discord community, where you can get personalized advice from 180-plus and counting sharp fantasy football minds that are helping each other dominate. 365 days of elite fantasy football analysis, resources, and Discord community. What's up, my friend? It's Mikey Henninger with Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, and I'm feeling like Santa Claus in early December. Welcome to Fantasy Football Draft Season, baby. This time of year, I'm usually inundated with questions about draft strategy, which players to target, which players to avoid, which player you should pick with the 1st, 4th, 8th, 12th pick in the draft, etc., etc., etc. So, over the next several days, I'll be posting a bevy of mock drafts right here on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And because I love and endlessly appreciate the folks who have supported my small business, Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, the settings for these mock drafts will be those that were requested by members of the BBFF family. But before we dive into those mocks, we should definitely discuss general philosophy, general strategy for the majority of 2025 fantasy football drafts, regardless of what spot you're drafting from. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that none of what we're about to discuss today is a must. None of what we're about to discuss is a rule. None of what I'm about to say is set in stone. Instead, these are tips, these are guidelines, these are recommendations that I've found to be successful in 2025 and frankly, over the last several years. But obviously, you must keep your own league in mind. How many teams are in your draft? What is your draft spot? Do you start 2 or 3 wide receivers? Do you have 1 or 2 flex spots? Do you have kickers? Do you have defenses? How many bench spots? How do your waivers work in your league? Is it PPR, half PPR, 0 PPR, super flex? Are there keepers? What platform are you playing on? How sharp is that platform's ADP? Are you playing with sharp fantasy football players such as members of the BBFF family? Or are you playing with casual fantasy footballers that printed off free rankings an hour before the draft? All of these things matter. All of these things are variables that can and should influence the way that you draft. And if you ever have league-specific questions, that's exactly what the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football Discord community is for. It's a friendly family of fantasy football players helping each other dominate. So, with all of that being said, with all of that out of the way, here's my general strategy for the majority of typical 2025 fantasy football drafts. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. When it comes to quarterbacks, now I generally want either an elite option, a guy that I'm going to start in every game, every week, regardless of their matchup or who they're playing against, guys like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, but The issue with those guys, as you know, is that they tend to come with a very, very expensive price tag. And quite frankly, more often than not, I'm not drafting those guys because they are so expensive. Instead, more often than not, I am waiting and I'm grabbing an upside quarterback significantly later with the intention of streaming that quarterback most weeks using the 2025 week winner. Now, the 2025 week winner, that is a top secret analytical resource that Basement Brood Fantasy Football members are using when they're setting their lineups every single week. If you've been tuned in previous years, it used to be called the heat map, and I am now calling it the week winner. But regardless of whether or not I go elite with Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, etc., or if I wait and grab an upside quarterback, regardless, I am drafting one. I'm leaving my draft with one quarterback so that I can use precious bench space on much more valuable positions such as running back and wide receiver. There's 32 different starting quarterbacks in the NFL every single week, and a typical fantasy football league only has 12 teams. So I'm pretty confident that I will be able to find a decent enough quarterback with a decent enough matchup to be fantasy serviceable every single week. I'll be able to plug and play a guy right off waivers, and that's exactly what the 2025 week winner is for, identifying those potential boom weeks so that you can plug and play a guy without hesitation. Now, all of that being said, there is one quarterback that I'm routinely finding in the 7th round of 2025 fantasy football drafts that's an absolute auto draft pick for me at that price. But I'm sure we're going to get to that guy in those upcoming mock draft episodes. Now, when it comes to running backs, I will typically walk out of the first 2 rounds of my 2025 fantasy football drafts with 0 or 1 elite running back. Ideally, I have 1, but I certainly don't force it. If there's an early run on running backs and there's not a running back that I like, I'm not going to go out of my way to reach for one. I'm more than happy drafting wide receiver to start the first 2 rounds. But what I won't do, and I mean almost never, like literally less than 1% of the time, will I walk out of the first 2 rounds of my 2025 fantasy football draft with 2 running backs. I'm almost never taking 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds. And that's probably not a surprise to you if you've listened to or watched any of my previous episodes, particularly the one where I mentioned that 93% of the top 300 teams on drafters.com over the last 3 years left the first 2 rounds of their fantasy draft with at least 1 wide receiver. Now, best ball, of course, is a different animal, but the same applies here. I generally want to build my team around wide receivers in rounds 1 through 4, 1 through 5, meaning I often don't even draft my second running back until about round 5 or 6. And I'll talk a little bit more about why in just a minute once we get to the wide receiver portion. Beyond that, I tend to target pass-catching running backs in ambiguous backfields, and then even later than that, in the later rounds, I'm targeting other people's handcuffs that offer RB1, RB2 type of upside if the guy in front of them goes down. But I am never, and I mean pretty much 99.9%, if not 100% of the time, I am never, ever targeting my own handcuff. The main reason for that is because it's the fastest way of capping your own upside. Think about it. Your own handcuff on your team only becomes valuable if one of your best players gets hurt. Yes, I know he's an insurance policy, etc., but there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's a downgrade in your lineup if you lose your best guy no matter what. Your Isaac Guerendo only becomes valuable in fantasy football if your Christian McCaffrey gets hurt. That sucks. There's no way of sugarcoating it. That sucks. So essentially, you're wasting a bench spot on a guy who will only help you if one of your best players gets hurt. It's just the fastest way of capping your own upside. So instead, the best possible way to maximize your upside is I'm targeting other people's handcuffs. So imagine if you have, let's just say, Bijan Robinson, and you also targeted Zach Charbonnet, and now Kenneth Walker gets hurt. Now suddenly you just walked into Jahmyr Gibbs as an elite running back number one, or whoever I said, Bijan Robinson, as an elite RB1, and now you have Zach Charbonnet, who's an instant high-end RB2 because something happened to Kenneth Walker. Now we're talking. That is where and how you maximize your upside, particularly at the running back position. And we'll talk a little bit more about how I use my bench spots and what guys that I target, but that is my general philosophy when it comes to running backs. By the way, if you're planning on doing a few mock drafts ahead of your upcoming draft to prepare for your league, instead of that, I highly recommend knocking out a few $1 best ball drafts over on drafters.com. They're like mock drafts, but with prizes and payouts on the line, and I even have free money for you to play with. Take a look. Hey, fantasy football kings and queens. Want to show off your drafting skills and perhaps even dunk on me in the process? When you join one of my exclusive best ball leagues over on drafters.com and use promo code BBFF, you're going to get a 100% match on your first deposit all the way up to $100. That means if you put in $10, Drafters will throw in another $10 for free. If you put in $100, Drafters will throw in another $100 for free. It's basically free money to play fantasy football with all the way up to $100, and that's not all. When you join one of my leagues, you're also going to get $10 off an annual membership to my small but mighty business, Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. So not only do you get free money from Drafters, but you also get a sweet discount on your membership to BBFF. It's already a win-win, and that's without even mentioning the cash prize and the bragging rights that you win if you come out on top. So join our latest league using the link that we left for you in the description of this episode. Use promo code BBFF and join me on the fantasy football field. We'll see you there. Now, as for wide receivers, as I mentioned before, this is where I tend to build the foundation of my team. I tend to build my team around elite, high-quality wide receivers, and I do that for a variety of reasons. Now, for starters, the demand for wide receivers in a starting lineup is greater than any other position in fantasy football because they take up the majority of your starting lineup. For instance, in a typical fantasy football league that starts 3 wide receivers and 1 flex, wide receivers could take up to 40% of your starting lineup. And there's a lot of fantasy leagues these days that are moving to 2 flex spots, meaning wide receivers could take up to 50% of your starting lineup. Now, if you walk out of your draft with the best wide receiver room in your league, you already have a weekly advantage at the most highly demanded position in fantasy football. The other main reason that I tend to hammer wide receivers early in 2025 fantasy football drafts is because wide receivers are significantly more difficult to replace than a running back is. They're significantly more difficult to replace. They're significantly more difficult to predict. And if you think about it, a guy like James Conner, let's say James Conner gets hurt and goes down, you can instantly project Trey Benson for about 15 plus touches per game. And volume is the key to fantasy football. 15 touches for a running back, that's worth something. But if Justin Jefferson gets hurt, can you instantly project 8 plus targets per game for Jalen Nailor? Of course not. Running backs are just a heck of a lot easier to plug and play off of waivers than wide receivers are. Now imagine if you had 4 of the top 25 wide receivers in the league on your roster, plus you rostered Zach Charbonnet later in the draft, and now Kenneth Walker goes down. Now all of a sudden you have 4 of the top 25 wide receivers and a top 10 running back, and you're suddenly the most dominant team in your 2025 fantasy football league. That's why it's key to stock up on elite wide receivers early. Now, as for tight ends, I'll warn you, my strategy with tight end tends to be a bit extreme compared to anything else out there that I usually see. You see, I either want an elite tight end that I'm going to start each and every week, regardless of matchup or situation, a guy like Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, or I am all in on George Kittle this year. But if I don't get one of those guys, there are a ton of times where I don't even draft a tight end because I know I'll just be streaming the position all season anyways. Why waste a roster spot on a guy that I know I'm going to end up dropping by week 2 or week 3? Now, that being said, I want to make it crystal clear. I don't necessarily recommend, it's very don't try this at home, right? I don't necessarily recommend that strategy, leaving your draft without a tight end, unless you know what you're doing, right? You need to know how to effectively stream the position for that type of idea to work, which, shameless plug, that is exactly what the 2025 week winner will help you with. But I don't necessarily recommend walking out of your draft without a tight end unless you know what you're doing. Now, all of that being said, I must note that this year does look quite a bit different. It looks significantly different than in recent years. In other words, there are a lot of intriguing options in the middle rounds this year. We're talking namely guys like Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson, Mark Andrews, Evan Ingram. A lot of those guys are available at a price tag that actually makes sense. And I'm fine with grabbing one of those guys if the price tag is right, if the price tag does make sense. But if I miss on those elite options that I mentioned earlier, if I miss on those mid-round guys that we were just talking about, then I personally am probably skipping a tight end altogether in my draft, and instead I'm using those precious spots on upside running back bench stashes, or even sneaky stashes like Brandon Ayuk or Christian Watson that I might be able to stash on IR for the first 6 weeks of the season, creating a new bench spot for me to just go ahead and grab whatever tight end I'm going to play in week 1. Then, once week 1 does roll around, I just use the 2025 week winner to pick up a tight end that has a great matchup for week 1. And if you're interested in learning more about what the week winner does or how it works, simply drop week winner in the comments below and I'll get in touch with you. Now, as for kickers and defense, I don't even bother. I genuinely don't even bother drafting either one of them unless I absolutely have to, unless there's some sort of rule in my league that you must leave your draft with a minimum of each position. But instead, like I mentioned for tight ends, I want to use those precious bench spots on upside running backs. And once week 1 rolls around, I'll just use the 2025 week winner to find defenses and kickers with great matchups that I can just plug and play, and I'm just going to do that every single week. Last year, Basement Brood Fantasy Football members had access to exclusive research that I was conducting to identify kickers that were going to score double-digit points in their upcoming game. It was actually a really fun, really successful experiment, and if I'm being honest, it's pretty valuable information to know when you're looking for even the slightest edge over your competition. What's up, my fellow fantasy football nerds? If you're looking to dominate your league from start to finish and win cool prizes along the way, it's time to join the Basement Brood Fantasy Football family. As a member, you're going to get our brand new 2025 Draft Dominator, which is your ultimate guide with tiers, rankings, and season previews for over 280 players to make sure you walk out of your draft with the best team in the league. And that's only the beginning. You're also going to get our 2025 Week Winner, which gives you contextual matchup analysis for every single player in every single game, every single week, so that you can conquer those difficult start-sit dilemmas and dominate your weekly matchups. And let's not forget our amazing Discord community, which is a family of passionate fantasy football players sharing strategy, workshopping dilemmas, and helping each other dominate 24/7, 365. Plus, if that wasn't enough, every single month you're automatically entered into our autographed jersey giveaway. It truly is a no-brainer if you want to take your fantasy game to the next level, have the most fun you've ever had playing this game, and support a small but mighty business along the way. Sign up today for just $69 for an entire year. Seriously. That's 365 days of total domination, community, and giveaways for less than your last bar tab. Join the BBFF family right now using the link that we left for you in the description of this episode. I'll see you inside. Ultimately, when it's all said and done, I will wrap up a typical 15 to 16 round draft with one quarterback, one tight end, 0 kickers or defenses, and a whole bunch of wide receivers and upside running backs. Now, assuming I go wide receiver heavy, usually something like 3 or 4 wide receivers after the first 4 rounds, the majority of my bench will be made up of pass-catching running backs and upside running backs. Guys like Zach Charbonnet, Isaac Guerrero, Trey Benson. So I'll usually conclude my 15 to 16 round draft with something along the lines of 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, 5 to 6 wide receivers, and then 8 to 9 of those upside running backs. Now, again, all of this is what has been pretty typical for me over the last 1,000 plus drafts and frankly over the last few years. But remember, none of this is a set in stone type of rule. I have done drafts this year where I take 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds. In fact, I've done a few very rare drafts where the draft board fell in a way that I drafted 3 running backs in the first 3 rounds. Now, don't get me wrong, it's more rare than a shiny Charizard, but it does happen, and that's the point that I'm ultimately trying to make here. These are recommendations, these are tips, these are guidelines that are successful for a typical fantasy football league, but it's important and it's imperative that you keep your own league, your own roster, your own settings, your own platform, all of those things in mind. There are going to be times where it makes sense to zig even when the data suggests you should zag. Just keep that in mind. If you're ready for a real challenge, you gotta check out Gonzo Sports. I had a chance to meet the guys behind it, 3 longtime players who loved Gonzo so much that they purchased it in 2021 to keep it going. You see, Gonzo's been around since 1983 with a one-of-a-kind scoring system that's not your typical PPR league. In fact, this thing will test even the most seasoned of fantasy football veterans. And the community? Incredible. You see, some leagues have been running for 30 plus years. We're talking real rivalries, deep strategy, and fantasy managers who treat it like it's a second job in a good way. Drafts start on August 21st, so sign up now at gonzosports.com using promo code BBFF at checkout for $50 off your first dynasty. That's going to do it for today's episode, and honestly, there's probably plenty that I'm forgetting, but that's what the upcoming series of mock drafts are for. My next episode is going to be a mock draft from the one spot, and it's going to be chock full of player analysis, roster construction insights, and a heck of a lot more. So be sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a thumbs up and comment below who you are drafting with the first overall pick in a 2025 fantasy football draft. I will see you on the fantasy football field very soon. Cheers. This brew's for you.